Do you suppose a place can have a soul, just the same as a man? Is it possible that a spiritual essence lingers in its confines, hewn into the flesh of its plaster and stone, the bones of its beams? These may have been the places that we called haunted, or maybe there were more of them than we perceived. Maybe some were just quieter than others. Maybe some were restless. Maybe they stirred and spun, the echoes of our lives, a residual identity of ages. Maybe. I had always been a skeptic, but my time aboard the Odyssey, drifting nowhere and bound for nothing, turned my doubt into wonder for many fantastic and frightening things. I could very well blame the change of heart on my growing delirium. I had been slowly losing my connection with reality for some time by then, after all. That would have explained my paranoia and superstition, but I couldn't reason away the reality of what I heard. A certain term has always held popularity among the circles of paranormal investigators, cryptozoologists, alien conspiracy theorists, and a great number of other infamous nut jobs. EVP, or electronic voice phenomena, the occurrence of human voices in the white noise of an audio recording. Audio engineers were well aware of the effect, but tied no supernatural origins to it. Psychologists said that the human brain has a need for order, attempting to find any pattern it can in chaos. And it's true. It's the reason why we see shapes in clouds, why we see the faces of religious icons in burnt toast. Subjective interpretation of EVP is no exception. We see what we want to see, hear what we want to hear, but I know what I heard. Amid the occasional pops and cracks within the windy hiss of the static, I heard a single, distant word whispered from the depths of a time long past. It was the last echo of our old world, and my old home. The last spark of whatever soul it may have once had. It spoke directly to me, and it spoke in such familiar, subtle mannerisms.
Daddy?
My son, my little boy. I was half asleep, nodding off after my 14th hour of monitoring the comm channel, but I heard him. It took me a moment to register the voice and realize it wasn't just a waking dream. I snapped to my senses, calling his name into the static void. Calling turned to screaming, begging, and pleading for a response, but to no avail. I fell to my knees in a fit of tears and despair, sobbing to the point of lightheadedness. One simple word, the most beautiful word I've ever heard. The only word I'd heard spoken by another in nearly a year. And it was gone, as quickly as I recognized it. I felt betrayed. I felt abandoned and lonelier than I'd ever felt in all the hours, days, and months alone on that godforsaken ship. The depression killed me. It left me bedridden for weeks. I confined myself to my living quarters, veiled in total darkness. I refused to leave my bed for anything more than to use the restroom and the occasional handful of water from the bathroom faucet. The light left my eyes while the days passed by in a dragging, timeless blur. Hunger relentlessly chewed and gnawed at my core, and it wasn't long before I fell ill. My feverish skin dripped with a cold sweat that hung unpleasantly in my unshaven stubble, and the warmth of the thermal sheets only made it worse. Then came the voices. My wife, my child, James, and a plethora of others both familiar and alien spoke to me from beyond the shadows. They spoke to me from the corners of the room, from beyond the portal door, from the depths of space, from back on Earth, and all from within my own mind. They whispered, pleaded, nagged, and attacked me to fill the hours of silence.
Daddy,
My son beckoned again.
come home. Come home to us.
It sounded just as real as it did over the comlink, perhaps more so.
Honey, you're late for dinner again.
My wife scolded.
When are you coming home? You know that I hate it when you make me worry like this.
I missed her laying next to me at night, and I thought of her every time I turned over to the colder, drier side of that queen-sized bed.
Sir?
James whispered from his makeshift coffin drifting into the infinite.
I don't have much family back home. Do you think anyone will be waiting for me?
Yes, James, I responded aloud. I remember giving him a friendly clap on the shoulder back then, the reassuring gesture of an older brother. I'm sure you're dearly missed. I miss you. I spoke to no one, only mumbled aloud into the empty room. They haunted me ceaselessly, stabbed at my mind with wailing sobs, shrill cries and screams, and sometimes the growling, rumbling, and gurgling of inhuman things. I couldn't get a single moment's rest, and the sickness grew worse with every spoken word. Were it not for the horrific taunts of the voices, I may have surrendered and resigned myself to death. I may have let the sickness take me, but I refused to let the madness win. My anger compelled me to survive, whatever the cost. Weak and dizzy from the fever, I crawled desperately to the end of my bed as the sheets bunched and wrinkled in my grip. I slid to the floor and my legs slapped the ground with a thud. I winced. I crawled for the portal door as quickly as my weakened muscles could manage, as though fleeing from the dense, suffocating smoke of a burning building. I was certain that my salvation lay just beyond that threshold. I was wrong. As I reached through the last few feet between me and the portal door, the motion sensors released the airlock, and the voices around me went silent. The doors slid open, and I gazed into the depths of a more tangible nightmare. The corridor behind had faded into total darkness, interrupted only by the violent flicker of a severed power cable writhing and licking at the air. In the light of those brief flashes, I was shown a hopeless state of wreckage, barely holding at the seams of its rivets and welding. I struggled to my feet and stepped beyond that foreboding threshold, and the floor paneling hazardly twisted and turned into a sharp, rusted upheaval beneath my feet. The walls strained in a concave collapse, leaving me with a claustrophobic sensation of being swallowed. Only those bursts of rogue electricity gave me any sense of space, shape, color, or direction, and the greater length of the corridor spilled into a lightless oblivion. This was not the sanitary and organized military vessel from which I had withdrawn, and never once did I hear a disturbance beyond my walls. It couldn't have been real, and yet it was all around me, offending my every sense. It certainly felt real as I groped my way through the dark and sliced the sole of my foot on a piece of shrapnel. I could only hope that I wouldn't contract tetanus. The last thing I needed was a case of lockjaw to add to my dilemma. I hobbled and crawled through the jagged mess, doing my best to navigate from memory. And I could hear distant creaks and groans, as the hollow spaces suffered against the weight of the failing structure. In the clamor, I swore that I could hear screams, shrill and desperate. But I had already vowed to keep the madness at bay. I reasoned that it must have been a leak in the air filtration system, or possibly a collapsed pressurization valve in one of the hull maintenance outlets. But who was I kidding? I had been harassed by the voices of dead loved ones not 10 minutes before, and I was in the middle of crawling my way through a veritable haunted house that seemed to manifest from nothing. Logic and reason were pointless. Yet I pressed on, blindly searching for the nearest emergency supply storage unit. I must have slid my hands over the walls for hours, more frantically with every passing minute. Fortunately, just as I was about to give in to panic and hyperventilate, my right index finger brushed over an almost undetectable seam in the wall. I sighed with relief and felt for the slightly raised surface of the bioelectric lock-release console. I passed my hand over the metal contacts several times and got no response. Of course, the secondary power system was shot, and at the most convenient time possible. I slammed my fist on the panel and reached for the manual release, which was sure to be hell on my weakened arms. I pressed with nearly my whole body weight to trigger the spring release panel, and I wrenched the handle counterclockwise until my forearm burned with the strain. My body fell slack as I heard the satisfying clunk and hiss of the pressure lock, and the cabinet panel lifted to reveal the storage racks. I felt around for a flashlight and prayed that its internal battery withstood the test of time. I was surprised at my own cynicism, really. I knew that these things were made to last. Otherwise, what good would they be as emergency supplies? Even more surprising was that my cynicism proved accurate, and the flashlight gave little more than a few weak flickers, no matter how many times I slapped it in frustration. After about 10 minutes of navigating the storage racks for a fresh battery, and another 5 or so trying to change it, the lamp finally blinked brilliantly to life. It shone directly on something disturbing to my immediate left, close enough that I could feel its icy breath against my cheek. I turned slowly, and there, I saw a frost-coated face staring at me with wide, bloodshot eyes.
Cold.
James spoke in a shout of a whisper.
I'm cold, sir. So cold.
I screamed in terror and stumbled back, dropping the still-shining flashlight as I fell. I could see the brief hints of the space around me in the strobe. Rusted cylinders of zero-G handrails, glinting corners of upturned floor panels, the flat glistening of dead lights overhead, and flashes of his dry eyes and cracked lips as he approached me like a puppet with broken joints. I tried to flee in a panicked, awkward crab walk as I watched the fleeting glimpses of his form, slowly drawing closer, reaching for me with one blue, frozen hand. Then, as the spinning light slowed to a halt, just as quickly as he had appeared, he vanished. Hesitantly, I snatched up the flashlight and darted my gaze around the corridor, but there was no broken, frozen corpse to be found. I sat there in disbelief, struggling to catch my breath and settle my pounding heart. No matter my resolve, it seemed that the madness had taken hold. It was so vivid. I could feel him standing there, feel the sepulchral chill wafting from his skin. I could have reached out and touched him if I had the courage. I just knew it had to be real. It had to be. I sat there in a fetal position, crying into the fold of my knees. I could no longer separate delusion from reality. Was I even awake? Or had my fever left me comatose? I didn't know, but the nightmare clearly wasn't over. Silence settled in. The creaks, the groans, the screams. It all stopped, and the quiet seemed to weigh heavier with every passing second as I sat there coddling my slashed foot. Nothing moved in the shadows. Nothing malicious, cryptic, or compelling. Nothing beckoning. The air remained still, and an eerie sense of an anonymous something's patient amusement surrounded me, suffocating me. Whether a terrible fever dream, or some twisted perversion of reality, the nightmare around me obviously had no intention of progressing until I made the next move. It, whatever it was, had grown tired of prodding and provoking, deciding instead to stand back and observe the effects on my torment. It wanted to see what I would do next. how I would cope with such a hopeless predicament, or if I would simply break. I would ordinarily say that entertaining the idea of some faceless, formless entity, let alone an ominous it, paints a portrait of textbook dissociative identity disorder. Then again, how many of those afflicted ever questioned their sanity? How many actually resisted the idea of their lingering other? The question didn't justify the implication of reality by any means, but it did ring of something less explainable by reason. My fever was getting worse, and the pain in my foot was spreading, becoming a threatening numbness. Combined with my hunger, I wasn't going to last very long. I didn't like the idea of entertaining it at my expense, but I had to do something. I had to take care of this sickness if I wanted to survive, and the first aid kit in the emergency storage didn't have what I needed. So I chewed up a couple of painkillers, wrapped my foot in gauze, and hoped it would be enough to get me to the medical ward. Alternating between braving the pain of walking and the relative relief of crawling, I made my way through the remaining length of the corridor to the lower deck access elevator. Of course, right on cue, the cacophony of wrenching, clanking, creaking, and clattering in the distance continued. The screams returned, as well, louder, clearer, and unmistakable. I attempted to outrun them, climbing down the elevator shaft's maintenance scaffolding, and nearly falling to my death more than once. But it did me no good. The hallucinations, if they really were hallucinations, continued to grow worse. They became aggressive and deliberate. Soon, the voices were joined by flashing visions of human forms, and not always familiar, standing in the visible gaps between broken and open airlock portals, turning corners and slinking away into the shadows. At first, they appeared ordinary, if distant, but began to deteriorate, growing grotesque and uncanny. They appeared again and again, sometimes bald, sometimes pale and thin, sometimes nude and covered in sickly yellow blotches, and sometimes a combination of these things. They wailed and moaned, shambled and wandered, hunched over and limp, all except for one. At the far end of the corridor, just before the next intersection, stood a small, frail-looking girl. She was bald like the rest, nude and pale, and the entirety of her eyes were a deep, solid gray like polished coal. She stood silently and smiled at me, wordlessly daring me to follow as she turned the corner, and I heard her playful giggle echo from the walls. I was terrified, but I had come too far to turn back. Afraid of losing her, I bolted through the remainder of the hallway, shivering every time a cold hand brushed over my skin, and my injured foot screamed with pain. I staggered to a halt and rounded the corner, only to find that she had disappeared. No doors lined that hallway. It was just a service tunnel. Yet, I found myself staring into over 100 meters of empty space, the last sound of her laughter still ringing at the far end. Confusion only gripped me for a matter of seconds before a flash of pain shot up my leg. The painkillers weren't working. I needed something stronger. The little girl would have to wait. My priority still lay in reaching the infirmary. I wasn't looking forward to patching myself up with my basic, less than impressive first aid field training, but it had to be done. My compromised immune system wouldn't let me put it off for much longer. The pain had become unbearable, and each step opened the wound further. I took to hopping the rest of the way on my other foot, which came to an end when I landed on the steep angle of another upturned floor panel. I stumbled to the side as I fought for solid footing, and a painful snap sounded from my ankle. I wailed in agony, and my stiffened body felt like an overturned log. Through tears and breathless sobs, I shakily turned the flashlight on the sharp white of a compound fracture piercing my skin, and my brutally twisted foot trembled with the trauma. I rested my head against the unforgiving floor, resigned. There was nothing more I could do. The addition of the new pain had effectively left me paralyzed. I could hardly move, and there was no more denying it. I would die in those tunnels. I must have laid there for an eternity, trying to ignore the pain in my leg which had by then reached my lower back. For all intents and purposes, I was done resisting my approaching doom. I instead took solace in the fact that I would be joining my family, whether it be in oblivion or whatever idea of an afterlife proved correct. Before, the proposition of giving up had felt pathetic, but I had made peace with the idea. Still, the nightmare consumed me and allowed me no rest. Just as I closed my eyes for what I hoped would be the last time, I felt the gravity centrifuge grind laboriously against its own mechanism beneath me, derail, and slow to a complete system failure. Weightlessness took everything that hadn't been bolted down, tossing me into the floating void with a jarring snap that racked my entire body with a soreness and whiplash. The flashlight flew from my hand as my back slammed against the wall behind me, knocking the wind from my lungs. I watched it spiral down the length of the corridor and briefly reveal the number of cadavers still floating about. They drifted countlessly, obstructing space as they collided with one another, and drifted apart like a slow scatter of billiard balls. The whirling flashlight collided with something unknown, shattered in the middle distance, and darkness enveloped me once again. Truth be told, in those brief moments of light, I felt like I belonged among the dead drifting about the ship, injured, ill, starving, dehydrated, and exhausted. The line between life and death had grayed substantially, and I felt much the way that they all looked. I floated in anti-gravity for some time, grateful for the weight lifted from my sore muscles and injuries, yet disoriented and nauseous. It was a strange comfort, and none too difficult to accept. More than to sate my hunger, more than to mend my wounds, I just wanted to rest. Settling weariness and fading worry, spaceless, timeless, it was alluring. Sweet oblivion, precious silence, warm despite the cold, soothing despite the pain. Resistance felt foolish, and contentment, in the end, was the only rational choice left. I heard voices again, but those conjured at my will. Voices of pleasant memories, of hello instead of goodbye, and I love yous instead of I'll miss yous. Sounds of the first words my wife ever spoke to me, of her vows at the altar, and of my baby boy's first cries in the delivery room. And then came a new voice, distinct from the chaos of all those before it. It spoke not in English, nor in any other human tongue, but I understood it all the same. Find me. It stirred something primal in me, made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. This was no delusion. Even in my pain, I had so far questioned the reality of what I saw. I had questioned the reality of the dark halls and the shambling human husks around me. But this was different. This was another entity entirely, something outside of my mind and prompted by nothing within me. Whatever it was my tormentor, the thing for which I held so much contempt. It was the thing in spite of which I vowed to survive and keep my wits about me. It was the malevolent it, the other, and the reason for everything. It was the answer and the escape. It was relief, and I would find it. Despite what some cartoon animators and film directors seem to think, you cannot swim in the weightlessness of anti-gravity to get around. Every action has an equal but opposite reaction, and apart from the artificial atmosphere, there is nothing to swim through. If you find yourself free-floating without a drift and without footing, then you're basically out of luck until someone or something comes along to give you a rebound. So I hung, helplessly in midair, willing but unable to press on. I spent the next hour in a barless cage, as the hunger twisted inside me and the fever diminished my sense of space. Even if I had decided to accept my fate, I wouldn't have found the peace and comfort for which I'd hoped. The medical ward was less than 50 meters from me. Before I lost the flashlight, before weightlessness made the concept of direction completely useless and abstract, I could even see the door. Even crippled by a shattered ankle, a slashed foot, a blaring fever, and a wrenching gut, I could have crawled the rest of the way if only I could have pulled myself together for a few more minutes. Nothing had been stopping me, and now that I wanted nothing more than to make the effort, I was literally stopped by absolutely nothing. I couldn't help but laugh at the irony. Moments after the thought came to me, so did my salvation. I heard the slowly approaching groans right before the sign above the medical ward mysteriously flickered to life. The dim glow showed me the way, and it lay just beyond another broken cadaver, drifting toward me with outstretched arms. I never expected such a gruesome sight to give me relief. Granted, I would have preferred it to be some inanimate object, but at that point, I would have accepted anything close enough to my body weight. Before the distance closed completely, I planted the sole of my somewhat good foot firmly on its face, and pushed, with all the remaining strength remaining in my leg. The kick sent the monster flipping backward, with an arc of blood sprouting from its shattered nose, and it gave me just the momentum I needed to find a handrail along one of the walls. As my foot met its face, as its lips rose to smear my foot with rotten wetness, as its teeth grazed and stung the edge of my wound, a yellow feeling of doom crawled over my skin. Whatever lack of comfort it had provided, I had subscribed to this experience as an unpleasant delusion. With that physical contact, that change of momentum, it all took on a new level of chilling tangibility. I landed on my broken ankle, and it was the worst pain I had ever felt in my life, but I ignored it. I couldn't let anything stop me. I had to keep moving. Slowly, carefully, I pulled myself hand over hand along the rail, ducking and dodging the vague silhouettes of hands and feet, ever closer to the sign's hope-giving light. I collided with several of the bodies around me along the way, and the impact threatened to throw me from my hold, but I persevered. After several short minutes and a mental eternity, I managed to reach the medical ward portal, but I wasn't close enough to trigger the motion sensor's airlock. Still clinging to the handrail, I flailed my legs toward the space before the door, hoping to evoke some sort of response. The door creaked and groaned against ages of rust, lurching open ever so slowly. It only managed to spare a meter-wide gap before it failed, but it was enough. In one final struggle, I squeezed and slid through the thin opening. I found the medical ward far more welcoming than I had anticipated. Not only was it built for ease of access to all systems by way of anti-gravity hand grips, but it also had its own backup generator. After all, a power failure during a critical operation would have been catastrophic. The generator clearly wasn't in pristine condition, as indicated by the portal's mechanical failure and the dimly blinking lights overhead. But again, it was enough. I scrambled about the room as quickly as I could, gathering surgical tools, antiseptics, anesthetics, a suture kit, and sanitation supplies. I strapped myself at the waist to one of the beds, then took a series of long, slow, deep breaths in preparation for the first step. Before I could take care of anything else, I had to reset my broken tibia. I injected a number of numbing agents around the laceration, cupped my hand over the exposed bone, bit down on a folded towel, and braced for the worst. I moved the bone as slowly as possible, trying my best not to pinch a nerve or rupture a blood vessel. Each slight push or pull was agony, and I shouted through clenched teeth into the muffling towel. Finally, and with surprising ease, the exposed bone slid into place beneath the skin, with a wet crunch and a spurt of blood. As my ankle righted itself, and my foot awoke with a sudden circulation, my jaw fell slack with a deep grunt of both pain and relief, and I fell onto my back against the cold sheets. I had hoped that whatever was left of my constitution would be enough to withstand the trauma, but I should have known better. As I lay there, lightheaded and fading fast, the world spun around me in an amorphous blob of color and darkness. I turned my head towards the gap in the portal door, and I could see a knot of rotting arms and fingers reaching through, the now familiar moans echoing from beyond. For a moment, I thought I saw my son's sweet face amidst their collective shadow. Then she appeared, the other, the it. She stood at my bedside and smiled down at me, staring through me once again with those cold gray eyes. She leaned in, her face close to mine, in an eerily intimate near kiss, and she spoke softly, only 2 words. "Come home." I passed out.